At first, no one noticed anything unusual about Ji-Eun Park. That was exactly how she wanted it. In a restaurant that never seemed to sleep, waitresses blended into the background like furniture. Plates moved from kitchen to table. Orders were written, forgotten, replaced by new ones. Customers remembered the food, not the hands that served it. Ji-Eun had learned to exist in that space between attention and invisibility. She arrived before most of the staff. She worked longer than anyone else. She spoke politely, smiled when required, and never gave people a reason to remember her name. Because attention led to questions, and questions led to things she could not afford to explain. For months, she had hidden the truth beneath loose uniforms and quiet endurance. Every morning she told herself the same thing. Just get through the day. Even when dizziness crept up her spine. Even when nausea twisted her stomach without warning. Even when exhaustion settled deep in her bones. Ji-Eun continued moving. Carrying trays. Taking orders. Clearing tables. Because survival depended on one simple rule. No one could discover her secret. The restaurant itself thrived on noise. Glasses clinked together, laughter drifted between tables, and the kitchen roared with constant motion. To the customers, it was just another busy night. To Ji-Eun, it was another careful performance. What she didn't know was that someone had already begun noticing the details she worked so hard to hide. Not the impatient customers. Not the manager shouting orders near the kitchen door. But the man seated in the quiet VIP section near the back of the room. A man most employees tried not to look at directly. Kang Min-jae, the owner of the building. The man whose name carried whispers through the city's underworld. He rarely visited the restaurant himself. When he did, the atmosphere changed in subtle ways. Conversations softened. Staff moved faster. Even the air seemed to tighten. Min-jae had a reputation for many things. Patience, control, and an unsettling ability to notice what others missed. While the restaurant focused on dinner service, Min-jae's attention drifted elsewhere. Toward a single waitress moving carefully between tables. Her steps were measured. Her posture slightly too rigid. Her hand occasionally pressing against her stomach when she thought no one was looking. To most people, it meant nothing. To Kang Min-jae, it meant concealment. He watched quietly as she continued working, carrying plates and pouring drinks with professional calm. Until the moment her balance finally betrayed her. Ji-Eun stopped suddenly beside the kitchen door. Her hand gripped the wall. For a second, she forced herself to breathe. Then she turned quickly and rushed down the narrow hallway behind the restaurant. The sounds of the dining room faded behind her. Her stomach twisted violently. By the time she reached the empty corridor, she could no longer stop it. She bent forward, gripping the sink as her body gave in to the nausea she had been fighting all night. The sound echoed harshly against the tiled walls. For several seconds, she could only focus on breathing. Slow, controlled, invisible again. When the sickness finally passed, Ji-Eun wiped her mouth and straightened slowly. She thought she was alone. Until she felt it, the quiet weight of someone standing behind her. Ji-Eun froze. A moment later, she turned, and her heart dropped. Because leaning casually against the hallway wall, watching her with calm, unreadable eyes, was Kang Min-jae, the last man in the world who should have seen her like this. For months, she had hidden the truth from everyone. But now the one man who noticed everything had seen the secret she could no longer hide. And Ji-Eun understood something immediately. From this moment forward, her life would never return to the quiet anonymity she had fought so hard to protect. Morning arrived long before the city fully woke. Ji-Eun Park was already on her feet when the first pale light slipped through the thin curtains of her small apartment. The alarm on her phone had not yet sounded, but her body had learned to wake before it did. Rest had become shallow lately. Easily disturbed by discomfort, she tried not to think about too closely. She sat up slowly on the edge of the bed, one hand resting against her stomach as a wave of nausea passed through her. It was brief. It was manageable. That was what she told herself. The apartment was quiet, the kind of quiet that came from living alone in a building where neighbors kept their distance. Ji-Eun preferred it that way. Silence meant no explanations, no curious glances, no conversations she didn't have the energy to navigate. She moved carefully through her routine. Water first, then a quick shower. Her uniform hung neatly by the door, pressed the night before. The fabric was slightly loose, chosen intentionally months ago when she realized she would need clothing that didn't invite attention. Everything about her routine was deliberate. Control had become its own kind of protection. By the time she stepped outside, the sky was still dim and cool air drifted through the quiet streets. The restaurant was only a short walk away. Ji-Eun kept her pace steady, conserving energy the way someone might ration water during a long journey. The restaurant looked different in the morning. Without the crowds and music, it felt larger. Empty chairs rested against polished tables, and the faint smell of cleaning solution lingered in the air. Ji-Eun liked this part of the day. Before the noise began, before customers filled the room and the hours started blending together, she slipped inside through the employee entrance and tied her apron around her waist. Soon the kitchen staff would arrive. The manager would begin shouting instructions. The rhythm of the restaurant would come alive again. For now, there was only preparation. She wiped tables, folded napkins, checked the arrangement of glasses under the soft glow of overhead lights. Small tasks, predictable tasks, the kind that didn't require questions. When the other staff eventually arrived, Ji-Eun blended into the movement of the room as easily as she always did. Orders were taken. Plates were delivered. Apologies were offered when food took too long. Customers rarely looked twice at her. That was the goal. To them, she was simply another waitress passing between tables. But invisibility required effort. Every step was measured. Every breath controlled. Every smile carefully practiced. Because if anyone looked closely enough, they might notice the faint exhaustion in her eyes, or the way her hand sometimes rested protectively against her stomach when she thought no one was watching. Ji-Eun had built her life around making sure no one ever noticed those things. And for months, she had succeeded. By the time the lunch rush ended, the restaurant finally began to quiet. Ji-Eun moved between tables with the same careful rhythm she had practiced for months, collecting empty plates and wiping the last traces of meals from polished surfaces. Around her, chairs scraped softly against the floor as the final customers drifted out into the afternoon light. To anyone watching, she looked like every other exhausted waitress finishing a shift. Only Ji-Eun knew how much effort it took to keep moving. The smell of food still hung in the air, garlic, fried oil, sweet sauces clinging to the warmth of the kitchen. Normally, she barely noticed it. Lately, it made her stomach twist. She paused briefly near the service counter, pretending to organize receipts while the sudden wave of nausea passed. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the wooden surface. Just breathe. Slow. Quiet. Invisible. After a moment, the feeling faded, leaving behind the familiar ache of exhaustion. No one seemed to notice. A group of waitresses laughed near the kitchen door, talking about weekend plans. The manager argued with a supplier over the phone. Somewhere deeper inside the kitchen, pans clanged loudly as the chefs began preparing for the evening rush. The world continued without interruption. Ji-Eun straightened and resumed working. That was always the solution. Keep moving. Movement left no space for questions. The first time she realized something had changed, she had ignored it. A missed cycle. A strange fatigue that sleep couldn't fix. She told herself it was stress. The second time, she stopped believing that explanation. The small white test had confirmed what she already suspected. She still remembered the silence of that moment. Standing alone in the bathroom of her apartment, staring at the result. Her first instinct had not been fear. It had been calculation. Could she keep working? Could she keep the job? Could she survive long enough to figure out what came next? The answers had not been comforting, but they were simple. She had no choice. So she adjusted. Her uniforms became slightly larger. Her meals smaller. Her movements slower when no one was watching. Every day became a careful balancing act between endurance and concealment. Sometimes the nausea arrived without warning. Other times it lingered quietly in the background, like a reminder her body refused to let her forget. Ji-Eun learned to hide it. If the feeling rose too suddenly, she found an excuse to step into the storage room. If dizziness crept into her vision, she leaned against a wall until the world steadied again. And every morning, she made the same silent promise. Just one more day. The child growing inside her remained a secret no one could see yet. But Ji-Eun felt it constantly. In the exhaustion that followed her through long shifts. In the way her body no longer belonged entirely to her. Sometimes, late at night in her apartment, she allowed herself to rest her hand gently over her stomach. Not with fear. Not exactly. More like quiet acknowledgement. A fragile life she was protecting the only way she knew how. By making sure the world never noticed it existed. By evening, the restaurant no longer felt quiet or spacious. Warm light spilled across the dining floor, reflecting off polished tables and glasses arranged with careful precision. Conversations blended together with a soft hum of music, creating the illusion of comfort that expensive places were designed to provide. Customers saw elegance. They saw attentive service, rich meals, and a room where everything seemed to run perfectly. What they didn't see was the invisible force behind it all. The building belonged to a man most people in the city preferred not to talk about too loudly. Kang Min-jae. To the public, he was a successful businessman. The official records listed investments, hotels, real estate, and a long list of properties that stretched across the city. But whispers traveled faster than paperwork. People spoke his name differently when they thought no one important was listening. Carefully. Quietly. Because Kang Min-jae was not simply a businessman. He was power. The kind that didn't need to raise its voice. Most nights he wasn't there. The restaurant functioned smoothly under managers and staff who followed rules that had never been written down but were understood by everyone. Serve the customers. Avoid trouble. And if the owner ever arrived, make sure nothing was out of place. Ji-Eun had heard the stories during her first week working there. A bartender had mentioned it casually while polishing glasses. "You'll know if he comes in," the man had said. The room changes. At the time, she hadn't asked questions. Questions were rarely useful. But over the months she began to understand what he meant. Sometimes a group of well-dressed men would enter and take the private tables near the back. Conversations among the staff would grow quieter. Managers suddenly appeared from offices they normally never left. No one announced anything. Yet everyone seemed to know. The owner had arrived. Ji-Eun had never spoken to him. In fact, she had only seen him once before. That night had looked much like any other. The restaurant was full, laughter echoing between tables while waitresses moved quickly with trays balanced in practiced hands. Ji-Eun had been pouring wine when the subtle shift passed through the room. It wasn't loud. It was instinct. People straightened slightly. Voices lowered. Even the manager's tone softened as he greeted someone near the entrance. Ji-Eun had glanced up briefly. And there he was. Kang Min-jae moved through the room with unhurried calm, his presence drawing attention without demanding it. His dark suit was perfectly tailored, his expression composed in a way that revealed very little. But there was something else about him. Something difficult to explain. The kind of quiet authority that made people move aside without being asked. He passed through the dining room like someone accustomed to owning every space he entered. Ji-Eun lowered her gaze quickly and returned to her work. That had always been her instinct. Stay unnoticed. Especially around men like him. Men whose lives operated in worlds far beyond the quiet survival she had built for herself. For someone like Ji-Eun Park, the safest distance from power was always the greatest one possible. Unfortunately for her, distance had a way of disappearing when it was least expected. Night settled fully over the city, and with it came the busiest hours of the restaurant. The dining room glowed beneath warm lights. Laughter rose from crowded tables, glasses clinked softly, and the kitchen pulsed with constant motion. Orders were shouted, plates moved in quick succession, and waitresses crossed the floor with practiced speed. For Ji-Eun, the world narrowed into a familiar routine. Take the order. Carry the tray. Smile politely. Move to the next table. Normally, The rhythm helped her forget the exhaustion that followed her through every shift. Tonight, the rhythm felt heavier. The smell from the kitchen seemed stronger than usual. Spices and fried oil drifted into the dining room, thick and overwhelming. Ji-Eun swallowed slowly as she delivered a plate to a couple near the window. "Enjoy your meal," she said with the same calm tone she always used. The woman thanked her, without looking up. Ji-Eun turned away, steadying the tray against her arm as she moved back toward the service station. Halfway across the room, the familiar wave rose again.
Sudden. Sharp.
Her stomach tightened painfully. She slowed her steps. Not here.
Not now.
The room felt warmer than before. The lights above the tables blurred slightly as she forced herself to breathe evenly.
Just keep walking.
She reached the counter and placed the tray down carefully, gripping the edge for a moment longer than necessary. The nausea twisted again, stronger this time, rising from deep inside her chest. Her body had been warning her all day. Now it was no longer asking for patience. Ji-Eun straightened quickly, trying to ignore the dizziness creeping into her vision. A nearby waitress spoke to her, asking something about table numbers, but Ji-Eun barely heard the words. All she could focus on was the pressure building inside her stomach. She shook her head quietly, murmuring an apology before turning away. The hallway behind the kitchen was only a few steps away. If she could just reach it. The dining room noise faded slightly as she walked faster, her hand brushing against the wall for balance. Each step felt heavier than the last. By the time she pushed through the kitchen door, the smell of food hit her like a wave. That was enough. Ji-Eun hurried down the narrow hallway behind the kitchen, the sounds of the restaurant muffling behind her. The small sink at the end of the corridor came into view just as her control finally broke. She barely reached it in time. Her hands gripped the cold edge of the sink as her body gave in to the sickness she had been fighting all night. The hallway echoed with the harsh sound of vomiting. For several long moments, nothing else existed. Just the tight ache in her stomach and the quiet struggle to breathe again. Eventually, the nausea faded, leaving her weak and trembling. Ji-Eun stayed where she was, leaning over the sink while the cool air of the corridor brushed against her face. Slowly, carefully, she straightened. She reached for a paper towel and wiped her mouth, trying to steady the shaking in her hands. Her secret had survived another close call. Or so she thought. Because as she lifted her head, a quiet presence behind her made the hallway suddenly feel much smaller. Ji-Eun turned, and her heart dropped. Kang Min-jae was standing a few steps away, watching her with calm, unreadable eyes. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The hallway felt unnaturally quiet compared to the noise of the restaurant only a few meters away. The muffled sounds of clinking dishes and distant conversation barely reached the narrow corridor. Ji-Eun's fingers tightened around the edge of the sink. Her mind moved quickly, searching for something to say, something simple that would make the moment disappear. But Kang Min-jae was still standing there. He hadn't moved closer, yet his presence filled the space with quiet authority. The dim hallway light caught the sharp lines of his suit, his expression calm and unreadable. He looked exactly the way he had in the dining room.
Composed.
Observant. Watching. Ji-Eun lowered her gaze quickly, hoping the movement would end the encounter. "I'm sorry," she said softly, her voice steady despite the lingering weakness in her body. "I'll clean this up right away." The apology came automatically, the same reflex she used whenever something went wrong during service. Min-jae didn't respond immediately. His eyes moved briefly from the sink to her posture, taking in the way she still leaned slightly against the counter. Not casually.
Carefully.
As if standing required more effort than she wanted anyone to notice. "You're sick," he said. It wasn't a question. Ji-Eun shook her head quickly. "It's nothing." Her answer came too fast. Min-jae noticed. Up close, the signs were clearer than they had been from across the restaurant. The faint color drained from her face. The small tremor in her hands as she folded the paper towel. The controlled breathing of someone forcing their body back into obedience. He had spent enough years observing people to recognize the difference between a minor inconvenience and something carefully hidden. This was the second. Ji-Eun stepped away from the sink, trying to regain the calm composure she used with customers. "I'll return to work," she said quietly. She took one step toward the hallway exit. The movement was slightly unsteady. Min-jae noticed that too. "You shouldn't," he said. His voice remained calm, but it carried the quiet certainty of someone unused to being ignored. Ji-Eun paused. For a second she considered arguing, but instinct quickly reminded her who she was speaking to. This wasn't the restaurant manager. This wasn't another employee. This was the man who owned the entire building. "I'm fine," she repeated. Min-jae studied her for a moment longer. People lied to him often.
Usually they did it badly.
Ji-Eun's lie was different. It wasn't careless. It was practiced. The kind of lie someone repeated so often it became automatic. His gaze shifted briefly to the hallway entrance, where the noise of the restaurant continued, as if nothing unusual had happened. Then it returned to her. "You ran here," he said calmly. Ji-Eun said nothing. "And you were sick," he continued, in the middle of a shift. Still she stayed silent. Min-jae tilted his head slightly, studying her expression the way someone might study a puzzle. People who are fine usually don't hide in hallways. The words weren't harsh. If anything, they sounded almost thoughtful. Ji-Eun felt the quiet weight of his attention pressing down on the fragile wall she had spent months building. She forced a small, polite smile. It was just the smell from the kitchen. For the first time, something shifted slightly in Min-jae's expression. Not belief. Interest. Because something about her explanation didn't match what he had just witnessed. And calm Min-jae had never been a man who ignored details that didn't make sense. Ji-Eun left the hallway as quickly as she could without appearing to rush. The moment she stepped back into the kitchen, the noise returned all at once. Voices calling orders, pans striking against metal counters, the constant rush of movement that filled the restaurant every night. It should have felt normal again. Instead, something had changed. She could still feel the weight of calm Min-jae's gaze lingering in the back of her mind. Ji-Eun moved carefully toward the service station, picking up a tray that needed to be delivered to one of the dining tables. Her hands were steady again, but the quiet tension in her chest refused to fade. She told herself the encounter was over. Men like calm Min-jae didn't waste time worrying about waitresses. They had larger concerns, larger worlds. And yet, across the dining room, calm Min-jae had returned to his table. He appeared relaxed, seated comfortably in the dim corner of the VIP section. A glass of dark liquor rested untouched beside him as one of his associates spoke about something in a low voice. To anyone watching, he looked like a man casually finishing his evening. But Min-jae was not listening to the conversation. His attention had shifted elsewhere, toward the movement of a single waitress crossing the floor. Ji-Eun carried the tray between tables with careful balance, delivering plates and collecting empty glasses exactly the way she had done every night before. To the customers, she was invisible. To Min-jae, she was suddenly very clear. Once a person noticed something unusual, it became impossible to stop seeing it. He observed the way she walked. Her steps were smooth, but slightly cautious. Not the relaxed stride of someone simply doing their job, but the controlled movement of someone managing discomfort. Min-jae leaned back slightly in his chair. His gaze followed her without drawing attention. When Ji-Eun bent down to place a dish on a table, her hand briefly rested against the edge of the chair before she straightened again. A small movement, almost meaningless. Except it happened again a few minutes later. And then again. Each time, she recovered quickly, smoothing the moment away with professional calm. Anyone else would have missed it. Min-jae didn't. He had spent years watching people carefully. Business negotiations, rival alliances, dangerous partnerships. Every decision in his world depended on understanding the details others overlooked. Patterns mattered. And Ji-Eun Park was showing one. Her expression remained polite and composed. Her voice remained steady when she spoke to customers. But her body betrayed her in quiet ways. The brief pauses when she thought no one was looking. The way her hand occasionally brushed against her stomach before returning to her side. The careful way she controlled her breathing after moving too quickly. Min-jae lifted his glass slowly, his eyes still following her movement across the room. Interesting. Whatever she was hiding, she had become very skilled at concealing it. But concealment had limits. He had already seen the moment her control broke in the hallway. And once Kang Min-jae noticed something unusual, he rarely stopped paying attention until he understood exactly what it meant. Across the restaurant floor, Ji-Eun continued working, unaware that the quiet safety of invisibility had already begun slipping away. The evening stretched on, the restaurant slowly settling into the steady rhythm of late service. Most of the tables had already finished their meals. A few couples lingered over drinks while soft music drifted through the warm glow of the dining room. Ji-Eun moved between the remaining tables with the same careful focus she had maintained all night. But the strain was beginning to show. The earlier sickness had drained more of her strength than she wanted to admit. Each step required quiet concentration. Each breath felt slightly heavier than the last. She tried to ignore it. Just finish the shift. That was always the goal. Across the room, Kang Min-jae noticed the change immediately. The careful control she had maintained earlier was beginning to crack. Her movements were slower now, the pauses between tasks slightly longer. He watched as she reached a nearby table to collect empty glasses. For a brief moment, her hand slipped from the tray. Not enough to drop anything, but enough to reveal the weakness she was trying to hide. Min-jae set his glass down. Something about the pattern he had been observing no longer felt like simple exhaustion. When Ji-Eun turned toward the service station again, a sudden wave of dizziness struck her without warning. The room tilted slightly.
She stopped walking.
Her hand pressed instinctively against the table beside her as she tried to steady herself. A nearby customer looked up in mild confusion. "Are you all right?" the man asked casually. Ji-Eun forced a small smile. "Yes, I'm fine." The words sounded weaker than she intended. Min-jae was already on his feet. He crossed the distance between them calmly, his steps unhurried but certain. Ji-Eun didn't realize he was there until his voice reached her. "You're not fine." The quiet certainty in his tone made her look up. For a moment she seemed caught between surprise and embarrassment. "I'm okay," she insisted softly. "It's just a long shift." Min-jae studied her face carefully. Up close, the details were impossible to ignore now. The pale exhaustion beneath her calm expression, the way her breathing remained uneven, and the instinctive way her hand rested protectively against her stomach. His gaze followed that movement, then returned to her face. "You should sit down," he said. "That won't be necessary," Ji-Eun replied quickly. She tried to step away. The movement triggered another wave of dizziness. Min-jae reached out instinctively, his hand steadying her arm before she could lose balance. The contact was brief. But in that moment, the truth became obvious. His eyes lowered slightly, studying the position of her hand against her stomach once more. The earlier sickness, the careful clothing, the fatigue she had been hiding all evening. The pieces fit together quickly. "You're pregnant," he said quietly. The words landed like a stone in still water. Ji-Eun froze. Her first instinct was denial. But the look in Kang Min-jae's eyes stopped the words before they could form. He wasn't guessing. He had already understood. Silence settled between them as the noise of the restaurant continued around them. For months Ji-Eun had protected that secret from everyone.
Friends,
Coworkers, the entire world. Yet somehow the one man she had tried hardest to avoid had seen through it within a single night. Ji-Eun slowly lowered her gaze. And in that moment, the truth she had fought so hard to hide no longer belonged only to her. For several seconds, Ji-Eun could not speak. The restaurant continued around them as if nothing had happened. A waiter passed by carrying plates. Soft laughter drifted from a nearby table. Somewhere in the kitchen, metal clattered against a stove. But the space around Ji-Eun and Kang Min-jae had grown strangely still. Her heart beat faster than she wanted to admit. She had imagined this moment many times during the past months, the moment someone would discover the truth she had worked so hard to hide. In every version of that moment, the outcome had been the same. Questions, disapproval, and eventually, the loss of the only job that kept her life stable. Ji-Eun slowly pulled her arm away from Min-jae's steadying grip. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. The apology slipped out before she could stop it. Min-jae's expression didn't change. "For what?" he asked. Ji-Eun lowered her eyes. "For causing trouble." It was the answer she had given her entire life whenever something went wrong. Min-jae studied her in silence. Around them, a few curious glances had begun to appear from nearby staff members. The restaurant manager noticed the scene from across the room and immediately stiffened. Min-jae noticed that too. His voice lowered slightly. "You're not finishing this shift." Ji-Eun looked up quickly. "I can still work." It was the first time her voice carried real urgency. "I'm fine." Min-jae didn't respond right away. Instead, he glanced briefly toward the manager who had begun walking nervously in their direction. The man stopped immediately when their eyes met. One small look was enough. Authority traveled faster than instructions. Min-jae returned his attention to Ji-Eun. "You were vomiting in the hallway," he said calmly. "You nearly collapsed 5 minutes ago." Ji-Eun swallowed. "I just need a moment." "No," Min-jae replied. The word wasn't loud, but it was final. "You need rest." Ji-Eun shook her head. "If I leave early, They won't," Min-jae interrupted quietly. The manager was now standing a few steps away, waiting uncertainly. Min-jae didn't even look at him when he spoke. "She's done for tonight." The manager nodded immediately. "Of course, sir." No arguments. No hesitation. Ji-Eun stared at the exchange, confusion flickering across her face. "I didn't ask for special treatment," she said softly. Min-jae's gaze rested on her again. "This isn't special treatment." "Then what is it?" For a moment, Min-jae didn't answer. His eyes moved briefly toward the restaurant floor where customers continued enjoying their meals, completely unaware of the quiet decision unfolding nearby. Then he looked back at her. Common sense. Ji-Eun felt something tighten in her chest. "You don't know anything about me," she said. Min-jae considered that. "No," he agreed. "But I know enough." His gaze drifted briefly to her stomach before returning to her eyes. "You're working long hours while carrying a child." Ji-Eun said nothing. "You're sick," he continued calmly. "And you're trying very hard to pretend you aren't." The truth of it landed heavier than she expected. Min-jae straightened slightly. "You won't be working like this anymore." Ji-Eun blinked in surprise. "I can't afford to stop working." Min-jae studied her expression for a long moment. Then he spoke again. "You won't need to." The quiet certainty in his voice carried something deeper than simple concern. It carried decision. And Ji-Eun slowly realized something unsettling. Kang Min-jae had already made up his mind. From this moment forward, she was no longer facing her situation alone. Ji-Eun left the restaurant through the employee entrance, the cool night air meeting her face like a quiet shock. For the first time in months, she was leaving before the shift had ended. The streets outside were calmer than the restaurant had been. Cars moved slowly along the road, headlights sliding across the pavement while distant voices drifted from nearby buildings. Everything looked ordinary. Yet Ji-Eun felt as if something invisible had shifted around her. She stood still for a moment, unsure what she was supposed to do next. Her routine had always been simple. Finish the shift, walk home, sleep, wake up and repeat the same quiet cycle the next day. But tonight the cycle had been broken. Behind her, the restaurant door opened again. Ji-Eun turned slightly as Kang Min-jae stepped outside. Even under the dim streetlights, his presence carried the same quiet authority it had inside the building. His driver stood beside a black car parked along the curb, waiting silently. Ji-Eun instinctively stepped back. "You don't need to wait," she said softly. "I can walk." Min-jae studied her for a moment. "You're not walking home tonight." The words sounded calm, but they left little room for argument. Ji-Eun felt the familiar tension rise inside her chest. "I've been walking home every night for months." That was before tonight. She hesitated. The truth was, she didn't fully understand what had changed. To her, the evening had simply exposed a secret she had tried to keep hidden. To Kang Min-jae, it seemed to mean something more. I don't want to cause problems, she said quietly. Min-jae opened the car door. You're not. Ji-Eun looked at the car, then back at him. People like him didn't involve themselves in the lives of waitresses. Not without a reason. You don't even know me, she said. Min-jae's expression remained unreadable. I know enough. The same words he had spoken earlier. Ji-Eun lowered her gaze briefly, her hand resting against her stomach again, without thinking. For months, she had carried this responsibility alone. Every decision, every worry, every quiet fear about what the future might look like. She had built her entire life around staying unnoticed. But tonight someone had noticed. And that someone was not the kind of man who simply forgot what he had seen. Ji-Eun slowly lifted her eyes again. What happens now? She asked. Min-jae didn't answer immediately. He looked out at the quiet city street, as if considering something far larger than the moment between them. Then he spoke. Now, he said calmly, you stop pretending everything is fine. Ji-Eun felt a strange mixture of relief and unease settle inside her chest. Because part of her understood something clearly for the first time. Her quiet life, the careful anonymity she had built around herself, was already disappearing. Being seen had changed everything. Being protected would change even more. Min-jae gestured toward the open car door. Get in. Ji-Eun hesitated only for a moment before stepping forward. As the car door closed behind her, she realized something she could no longer deny. The life she had been living until tonight was over. And whatever came next would never be quiet again.